People say that knowledge gives you power, but in the shadowed corners of the world, that is a lie. Real power is forged from the secrets you keep locked away. Within the brutal ecosystem of organized crime, silence is more than just a virtue. It is a weapon sharpened to a razor's edge. Victor Kalin, a man who commanded the city's criminal underworld with absolute authority, moved through the opulent restaurant like a king surveying his domain. He felt untouchable, a deity among mere mortals. He cast a brief, dismissive glance at the woman attending his table, seeing not a human being but an insignificant object, someone so far beneath his notice she was practically invisible. He turned to his associate and spoke in German, sharing a cruel jest at her expense, utterly convinced that her simple uniform signified an equally simple mind. He wanted to see her flinch. He expected her to cower. His only demand was that she perform her duties in absolute invisible silence. But Victor Kalin had just made the single greatest mistake of his life, because he had no concept of who this woman truly was. What happens when the creature you have marked as prey suddenly turns and speaks the language of the hunter? You are about to find out. The secret she holds is a key that will unlock the destruction of his entire empire. The Obsidian Lounge was a modern cathedral dedicated to the worship of wealth, where the very air was perfumed with the scent of money and expensive cologne. The lighting was a carefully engineered masterpiece, low enough to cloak secret handshakes and illicit agreements, yet bright enough to catch the fire of diamonds on every gesturing hand. For Issa Corwin, however, this sanctuary for the rich was just another exhausting shift in a long line of them. It was a Tuesday evening that felt as heavy and soul-crushing as a Monday. A deep, persistent ache radiated up from the balls of her feet, an unwelcome but constant reminder of the mandatory 2-inch heels she was forced to wear. The starched, brilliant white apron she wore felt less like a piece of clothing and more like a set of shackles, binding her to a life she never chose. This was never how her story was supposed to go. Just 3 short years ago, her world had been one of academic rigor in lecture halls and quiet study in vast libraries. She was on the verge of completing a distinguished degree in international relations at the prestigious University of Zurich. Now, her existence had been brutally simplified to refilling water glasses for arrogant men who treated tipping not as a show of gratitude, but as an opportunity for verbal sport. She drifted through the room with her eyes dutifully fixed on the floor, her dark hair pulled back into a severe, tight bun. The severe hairstyle was a constant, sharp pain against her scalp. But it was a necessary pain, one that helped hide the aristocratic contours of her face. These were features she now carefully concealed behind tall stacks of menus and overpriced wine lists. "Table 4, Arthur, the floor manager, hissed as he scurried past. He was a man who seemed to wear a permanent sheen of nervous sweat. "That is the VIP section. Do not make eye contact with them. And for God's sake, Issa, show a little more urgency than you did last time." Issa gave a short, robotic nod, her fingers clenching the heavy tray loaded with crystal. She did not need any warning about who was seated at that table. She had felt his presence the second she walked into the room. It was as if the entire atmosphere of the restaurant had tilted, pulled by an invisible, powerful gravity toward one man. He was located in the semi-private alcove, a space surrounded by floor-to-ceiling windows that displayed the dazzling panorama of the Manhattan skyline. Victor Kalin was positioned at the head of the table, and he was surrounded by 3 men who clearly were not there for the food. They were his protection, and their expensive Armani suits failed to disguise their actual purpose. Victor himself was a man of a stark, almost brutal beauty. He had a sharp jawline, eyes the color of ice that appeared to dissect and understand everything they looked at, and a presence that radiated complete control. He did not merely sit in the chair, he possessed it as if it were a throne. He was the unchallenged leader of the Kalin Syndicate. On the surface, his organization was a legitimate global logistics empire, a massive enterprise moving everything from exotic sports cars to heavy industrial machinery across continents. But beneath that polished corporate veneer, It transported products that never appeared on any official shipping manifest. Issa approached the table with a practiced grace, her years of training forming an invisible shield of professional detachment around her. She placed the heavy, condensation-beaded water glasses on the table, her movements so precise and silent they were almost unnerving. "Would you prefer sparkling or still water this evening?" she inquired, her voice intentionally flat, carefully scrubbed of any trace of emotion or personality. Victor did not even grant her the courtesy of looking up from the illuminated screen of his phone, his brow furrowed in deep concentration. "Still," he commanded, dismissing her with a casual flick of his wrist, the kind of gesture one might use to wave away a fly. One of his men, a brutish individual with a jagged scar that split his eyebrow in two named Stefan, offered her an open, contemptuous sneer. "Bring the wine list," he ordered gruffly. "The real one, with the expensive bottles." "Of course, sir, right away." Issa turned to retreat, but she held her position for a fraction of a second too long. Her eyes, against her will, fell upon the screen of Victor's phone. Displayed on it was a complex architectural blueprint. Her heart suddenly began to hammer against her ribs like a trapped bird. She quickly looked away, but the image was already burned into her memory. She knew that layout. She knew it with a chilling intimacy. It was the highly restricted container terminal at the port of Hamburg. As she walked back toward the sommelier station to retrieve the list, the sophisticated symphony of the restaurant, the gentle clinking of silver on porcelain, and the low, smooth hum of a live jazz trio dissolved into a deafening roar in her ears. It was the sound of her own blood rushing, a tide of fear and adrenaline. For 3 long, agonizing years, she had been running. She had been hiding from the vicious, predatory world that Victor Kalin not only inhabited, but commanded. And now, through some impossibly cruel twist of fate, she found herself standing directly in front of him, serving him a glass of water. When she returned, accompanied by the restaurant's wine expert, Victor was immersed in a tense, hushed conversation with Stefan. They immediately fell silent the moment they registered her presence. For the first time all evening, Victor actually looked at her, truly looked. His gaze held no admiration, no curiosity, not even a flicker of interest. It was cold, clinical, and utterly dismissive. It was the look of a scientist examining a specimen under a microscope. He took in her hands, calloused from work, the slight, almost imperceptible fraying on the collar of her uniform, and the deep, exhausted shadows that lay like bruises beneath her eyes. With an expression of profound and undisguised disgust, he turned his attention back to Stefan. He switched languages effortlessly, his voice transforming into the harsh, guttural sounds of German. "A pretty enough face, I suppose, but completely hollow inside," Victor commented, his tone saturated with the casual cruelty of the infinitely powerful. "She is almost certainly as dumb as a loaf of bread. These women all share the same pathetic, predictable destiny. They either end up on their knees for men like us, or they end up begging on the street." Stefan released a low, appreciative chuckle, a horrible sound of agreement, and took a long, slow drink of his water. "Verschwendung," he replied, letting the German word for a waste drip from his lips with utter contempt. Victor's mouth curved into a self-satisfied smirk, completely and blissfully unaware that the supposedly empty-headed waitress who was now pouring his $500 Pinot Noir had spent her entire childhood speaking fluent, perfect German in the most exclusive boarding schools of Geneva. He continued his private conversation, his voice dropping into a conspiratorial whisper. "You will ensure that shipment clears customs no later than morning. If the Meyer family makes any kind of move on our containers at Dock 4, you have my explicit permission to burn them all to the ground. I do not care about collateral damage or witnesses, I just want the job done." Issa's hand remained impossibly steady as she poured. Not a single tremor, not a single drop spilled. She did not flinch, she did not gasp. She continued her task of pouring the expensive red wine with the focused, detached precision of a surgeon, filling each crystal glass to its exact, perfect level. But beneath that mask of calm professionalism, a glacial rage was beginning to solidify in her veins. It was not just his disgusting personal insult. She had learned long ago to expect nothing more from men like Victor. It was the name he had just spoken, the Meyer family. They were not just some anonymous business rivals he was scheming against. The Meyers were the monsters who had stolen her childhood and made her an orphan. They were the entire reason she was now Isa Corwin, a struggling waitress, instead of her true self, Isabella von Amsberg, the sole heiress to a powerful shipping dynasty that had been brutally dismantled, utterly destroyed, and erased. Victor Collin was not just an arrogant, infuriating customer. He was a business partner to the very men who had murdered her father in cold blood. Isa carefully placed the heavy wine bottle back on the linen-covered table, the condensation on the glass feeling like ice against her fingertips. In that single, suspended moment, she stood at a crossroads with two possible futures stretching out before her. She could turn around and walk away, melting back into the shadows to preserve the fragile, precarious safety of her hidden new life. Or she could strike a match and set this entire charade ablaze. She looked directly at Victor. As she expected, he was already ignoring her again, anticipating that she would simply evaporate back into the background noise of his evening. Isa cleared her throat. It was a small, quiet sound, barely a whisper, but in the sudden, tense silence that had fallen over table 4, it echoed with the force of a gunshot. Victor paused, his wineglass halfway to his lips. He lowered it back to the table with deliberate slowness, his expression shifting from bored indifference to one of pure, unadulterated annoyance. "Is there some kind of a problem here?" he asked in English, his words sharp, clipped, and dangerous. Isa straightened her spine. For the first time all night, she allowed the crushing weight of her exhaustion to fall away from her. She pulled her shoulders back and lifted her chin, her entire posture transforming in a way that was both subtle and profoundly unsettling. The tired, invisible waitress vanished completely. In her place stood someone who carried herself with the undeniable, regal bearing of a queen forced to live in exile. She met Victor's cold gaze without a hint of fear. The icy blue of his irises seemed to clash against the burning, defiant fire that now blazed in her dark brown eyes. "Ihre Manieren sind so schlecht wie Ihre Einschätzung meiner Intelligenz," Isa said, her voice clear and steady. Her German was flawless, not the clumsy, accented German of a student or a foreigner, but the crisp, precise, high dialect of the European ruling class. The sentence translated to, "Your manners are as poor as your estimation of my intelligence." A profound, heavy, and absolute silence crashed down upon the table. It was so complete it felt like the air had been sucked from the room. Stefan began to choke on his water, sputtering violently into his napkin. But Victor did not move a single muscle. He was frozen solid, his hand tightening its grip around the delicate stem of his wineglass until his knuckles turned the color of bone. All the noise in the bustling restaurant simply faded away, replaced by a silent, pulsing energy that crackled between the two of them. But Isa was not done yet. She took a single, deliberate step closer, invading his personal space with an audacity that was its own kind of weapon. "Und übrigens," she said, her voice dropping to a low, intimate whisper, a secret meant only for him and the men at his table. She then switched to perfect, unaccented English for the others. "And by the way, if you send your men to attack the Meyer family at Dock 4, you will be sending them into a slaughter. The Meyers always use that dock as bait to draw out their rivals. Your actual shipment is being quietly rerouted through Rotterdam as we speak, but I am sure you would have known that already, if you were not so busy harassing the help." Victor's face went white, a canvas of pure shock, before a dangerous crimson tide of fury washed over it. He launched himself to his feet, his chair screaming in protest against the polished floorboards. The violent sound was a shockwave, causing diners at nearby tables to stop and stare. Victor neither noticed nor cared about the attention. He loomed over her, a mountain of a man radiating an aura of pure, unrestrained violence. "Who are you?" he snarled, his voice a low, threatening growl. "Who sent you to me?" Issa met his burning gaze without a trace of fear. "No one sends me, Mr. Kalin. I am my own agent." She turned on her heel, preparing to walk away, but his hand shot out like a striking snake, clamping around her wrist. His grip was a manacle of solid steel. The sudden, searing heat of his skin sent a bizarre shock through her, a confusing jolt of primal fear mixed with a surge of wild adrenaline. "Let go of me," she commanded, her voice staying remarkably steady and calm. She glanced down at his powerful hand crushing her wrist, then raised her eyes slowly to meet his. "Unless you want this evening to end with a very public scene, followed by the police discovering that unregistered firearm you have concealed in the left pocket of your jacket." Victor's eyes widened, a tiny, almost imperceptible reaction. He snatched his hand back as if her skin had turned to white-hot metal. He simply stared, his mind racing, desperately trying to solve the impossible riddle she presented. She was a waitress who spoke flawless High German, knew the secret logistics of European smuggling rings, and could identify a hidden weapon from across a room. This was no ordinary woman. "You realize," Victor said, his voice now a venomous, quiet threat, "that you have just guaranteed your own death. No one learns my business and is allowed to walk away." Issa gave him a smile that was both chilling and utterly devoid of warmth. "I already died 3 years ago, Victor. You cannot threaten a ghost." With that final word, she turned and walked away, her spine straight and her head held high. She left the most feared man in the city staring after her, trapped in a state of paralyzed, silent disbelief. It was only when she was back in the frantic heat of the kitchen that Issa's carefully built composure finally cracked and fell apart. Her hands started to tremble so badly she had to clutch the cold edge of a stainless steel counter just to keep them still. She had done it. She had just announced her existence to the entire Callan crime syndicate. It was an act of complete, suicidal madness. "Issa!" Arthur, the manager, rushed toward her, his face a mask of sheer panic. "What in the name of God did you just do? Mr. Kalin looks like he has seen a spirit. He is demanding to see the owner right now." "I quit," Issa stated, her voice flat and empty. She untied the strings of her apron and tossed the garment, a symbol of her servitude, onto the counter. "Send my last paycheck in the mail." She grabbed her coat from a nearby hook and fled through the back service door. She stepped out into the cool, damp air of the New York night, her heart pounding against her ribs. She had to run, and she had to do it immediately. It was time to become a ghost all over again. She knew how men like Victor Kalin thought. He would never let this insult go. He was a hunter, and she had just painted a massive target on her own back. But as she hurried down the dark, garbage-filled alley, carefully avoiding the bright pools of light from the street, she never saw the black sport utility vehicle waiting silently at the corner. She did not notice Stefan as he stepped out from the passenger side, a cell phone already pressed firmly to his ear. "Boss," Stefan said into the phone, his eyes fixed on Issa's disappearing form. "She is making a run for it. Should we grab her?" On the other end of the line, Victor stared at the empty space where the waitress had stood just moments before. He reached down and picked up the wine glass she had filled, turning it over and over in his hand, studying it in the dim light. "No," Victor finally said, a dark and new obsession taking root in his mind. "Do not touch her. Just follow her. I do not want a single scratch on her. I want to know everything about her. I want to know who her master was." He paused for a beat. "And Stefan." "Yes, boss? I need you to find out exactly how she knew about Rotterdam. If she was telling the truth, she just saved this organization $50 million. But if I find out she was lying to me, I will end her myself." Isla's apartment in Astoria was a masterclass in living an invisible life. It was a miserable 4-floor walk-up, with stained beige wallpaper peeling in sheets from the damp walls and a radiator that rattled and hissed like a dying animal. The real story of her life was buried much deeper. Underneath the floorboards of her bedroom closet, hidden beneath a plank she had carefully loosened 3 years prior, were the last remaining artifacts of Isabella von Amsberg. She fell to her knees, a strangled sob caught in her throat, and furiously pushed aside the cheap, rumpled waitress uniforms. Her trembling fingers quickly found the familiar groove in the loose plank, and she pried it up from the floor. Hidden in the dark space beneath was a waterproof duffel bag and a small, heavy metal box. She opened the box first, her hands shaking. Inside, there was a Swiss passport with a name that was not hers. There was also a thick stack of cash bound by simple rubber bands, and a single worn photograph. The picture was of a man with silver hair and a severe look on his face. He was standing on the polished deck of a yacht, his hand resting possessively on the shoulder of a laughing teenage girl. Heinrich von Amsberg, the celebrated Zurich shipping tycoon, and his adored daughter. "I am so sorry, father," she whispered, her thumb stroking the image of his face in the old photo. "I made a terrible mistake. I let my rage get the better of me." She never should have approached Victor Kalin. She knew the most important rule of the secret world she now lived in better than anyone. Silence equals safety. But seeing him in the flesh, the very man whose criminal organization had orchestrated the corporate sabotage that drove her father to suicide, had shattered some vital wall deep inside of her. Isabella shoved the photograph into the duffel bag. She had to leave. She had to leave this very second. If Victor was even half as smart as she feared, his men would not be looking for a simple waitress named Isla. They would be searching for the anomaly, for the ghost in their system. She ripped off her work clothes, her hands moving with frantic speed, changing into dark jeans, heavy boots, and an anonymous black hoodie. She let her long hair down to hide her face and pulled a baseball cap down low over her eyes. With the bag clutched tightly in her hand, she crept to the window, peering carefully through the grime on the blinds. The street below was completely still, a deep silence that felt unnatural and deeply threatening. 3 miles away, in the penthouse office at the top of Kalin Tower, the atmosphere was thick with a palpable tension. Victor stood like a statue by the window, his gaze locked on the glittering expanse of the city below him. The glass was strong enough to deflect a bullet, and yet in that moment, he felt completely vulnerable. Behind him, Stefan was speaking urgently into his phone, his voice tight with controlled excitement. He finally hung up and turned to face Victor's back. "The information about Rotterdam," Stefan said, his voice filled with importance. "It was 100% correct, boss. Our source at the port just confirmed everything. The Meyer family had moved their most vicious killers to Dock 4 an hour before we were supposed to arrive. They were waiting to ambush us. If our team had gone in there, they would have been walking into a massacre." The real shipment, the priceless prototype chips, had just cleared customs in Rotterdam, hidden under the name of a shell corporation. Victor turned around from the window, his movements slow and deliberate. The hot rage that usually consumed him was gone, replaced by a cold, sharp curiosity that was infinitely more dangerous. "She saved us," Victor breathed, his voice barely audible. A waitress, a simple waitress at the Obsidian Lounge, had just saved his empire $50 million and the lives of more than a dozen of his best men. "Who is she?" Stefan asked, his voice full of disbelief. "Is she an agent from a rival family? A spy trying to get on our good side?" "No." Victor walked to his desk, where a file folder lay open. Its contents were laughably thin, almost non-existent. "I had our cyber team do a complete background search. Isla Corwin. Her social security number was issued 3 years ago in Ohio. Before that date, she is a complete ghost. There is no birth certificate, no school records, no financial history. The person known as Isla Corwin simply did not exist before the year 2023. He picked up a grainy photograph printed from the restaurant's security camera. The image was out of focus, but her posture was perfectly clear. The way she held herself, the proud angle of her chin, that was not the stance of someone paid to serve others. That was the stance of a person who was used to commanding attention the moment she entered a room. She speaks perfect High German, Victor murmured, tapping the photo with his finger. She understands the hidden currents of international logistics, and she carries herself like a queen. Complex workings of the Meyer family's shipping empire, and she even mapped out the entire Hamburg terminal layout just by looking at my phone from 3 feet away while the screen was upside down. She has a background in intelligence, Stefan suggested, stating it as a fact. Or perhaps she was once royalty, Victor corrected him, his voice barely a whisper. He carefully lifted another document from the stack on his desk. I tasked the team with running her face through every European database we could access. The process was slow because she's so much thinner now, and her features have grown hard with time. But the software found a match. Look. He pushed a glossy magazine page across the desk's mirror-like surface. It was a feature from Forbes Europe, an article published 4 years in the past. The headline was a brutal summary. The Fall of the House of von Amsberg, How Corruption, Suicide, and a Missing Heiress Brought Down a Dynasty. Stefan's eyes widened in disbelief. He looked from the radiant, smiling young woman in the photograph back to the cold, grainy image captured by their security camera. Isabella von Amsberg, he whispered, the name sounding like a ghost story. The shipping heiress. The entire world thinks she died. The official report said she threw herself into Lake Geneva right after her father's empire crumbled under the weight of scandal. She did not drown, Victor said with absolute certainty, a dark, predatory smile playing on his lips. She ran. She fled all the way to New York, choosing to vanish in the one place no one would ever bother to search. But that makes no sense. Why would she come to us with a warning? Stefan asked, his confusion total. We are the Collins Syndicate. We were the very contractors hired to dismantle her father's corporation. By every account, we should be the last people she would ever trust. That, Victor declared, rising from his chair and reaching for his coat, is precisely the question I intend to ask her myself. Have the car brought around. And I don't want the assault unit. I want the extraction team. If the Meyers get even a hint that she is alive, they will not hesitate to finish the job they began 4 years ago. We must get to her before she disappears from the world a second time, for good. Isabella had made it nearly 3 blocks before the ice-cold certainty washed over her. She was not escaping. She was being carefully and deliberately herded. After slipping out of her apartment building through a basement laundry room, she had stepped into the deep shadows of a service alley. She moved with a steady, determined pace toward the closest subway entrance, trying to melt into the darkness. But the entire energy of the street felt wrong, orchestrated. A black sedan eased onto her block, its speed unnaturally slow. Further down, a man in a gray trench coat bent down to tie his shoe, but he remained in that position far too long. She knew then that she had been discovered. A spike of pure, unadulterated panic stabbed through her chest, sharp and freezing. She spun on her heel, making a desperate break for the harsh, bright lights of a 24-hour convenience store. A cheerful little bell chimed over the door, announcing her frantic entry. She moved quickly toward the back of the narrow aisles, pretending to examine rows of dusty soup cans. Her gaze was locked on the warped, fisheye reflection in a large security mirror high in the corner. Outside, she could see him. The dark shape of the man in the trench coat was waiting, a patient hunter posted just beyond the glass. Her mind raced, searching for another exit, any other way out. The store surely had a rear delivery entrance, but it would be locked, very likely wired with an alarm. Her hand plunged into her coat pocket, her fingers closing around the cold metal of a tiny pepper spray canister, a ridiculously inadequate defense against the kind of trained killers who were after her. Yet it was the only weapon she possessed. With a surge of resolve, she pushed toward the back room, shoving her way through the thick, swinging vinyl strips that served as a doorway. "Hey, you cannot go back there. That is for employees," a bored voice called out from the front counter. "Bathroom!" Isabella yelled back without turning or slowing down. She slammed into the heavy steel door at the rear of the stockroom. Just as she feared, it was locked tight. She threw her full weight against it, but the frame did not so much as shudder. The little bell at the front door chimed again. He was inside the store now. He wasn't going to wait. In a flash of instinct, she seized a heavy plastic crate stacked high with soda, bottles, and swung it with all her strength against the door's lock mechanism. The powerful blow did not break the door open, but it did manage to shatter the alarm's contact sensor. A deafening siren immediately began to shriek, filling the small space with an unbearable noise. Chaos was here, and chaos was her only chance. She kicked the door again and again, adrenaline flooding her system and giving her a burst of furious strength. With a piercing shriek of twisted metal, the latch finally gave way. She tumbled forward into the dark, damp alley and scrambled instantly to her feet. Then she ran. She sprinted down the narrow passage, her shoes splashing through oily puddles of water, the cold air burning in her lungs like fire. Her one singular thought was the subway. If she could only reach the tunnels, if she could just descend into the sprawling labyrinth beneath the city streets, she might actually have a chance to disappear. She burst out of the alley's mouth and onto a wide avenue, frantically dodging through the relentless stream of late-night cars. Horns blared in a chorus of angry protests. A yellow cab screeched to a halt, swerving violently to avoid hitting her. Isabella! The voice sliced through the city noise, and the sound of her real name froze the blood in her veins. That was not Isla. That was the name of the woman she had buried long ago. She spun around, her heart hammering against her ribs. A massive black sport utility vehicle had mounted the curb, its sheer size blocking her path completely. The rear door slid open without a sound. Victor Kalin was sitting inside. He looked entirely calm and collected, an image of incredible power and refined wealth that was completely out of place in the urban decay of Queens. "Get in the car," he said. His voice wasn't a command shouted over the noise. It was a simple statement of fact. "Go to hell!" Isabella choked out, taking a clumsy step backward. "You have precisely two options at this moment. You can choose to go to hell, or you can choose to get into this car," Victor stated, his voice rising just enough to be heard over the approaching wail of police sirens. "Now, I suggest you look to your left." Isabella's head jerked to the side. Half a block away, a silver sedan was idling near the curb. The rear window was down, and the sleek barrel of a suppressed submachine gun was clearly visible, glinting under the yellow glow of a streetlight. "That is the Meyer family's private cleanup crew," Victor explained, his tone conversational. "They must have flagged your credit card the moment you walked into that store. They are not here to talk, Isabella. They are here to tie up a loose end. I, on the other hand, am merely extending an invitation to dinner." Isabella's eyes darted from the menacing silver car to Victor. A door on the silver car was now swinging open. Two men dressed in dark, tailored suits were emerging. She had no real choice at all. Isabella threw herself into the cavernous back seat of Victor's sport utility vehicle. "Drive," Victor ordered his driver. The man slammed the accelerator to the floor. The tires screamed as they burned rubber on the asphalt, and the huge vehicle lunged forward, forcing its way into the moving traffic with brutal efficiency. The aggressive maneuver happened just a split second before the first bullet hit the sidewalk, kicking up a shower of sparks from the very spot where Isabella had been standing. The drive into Manhattan was completed in a heavy, unnerving silence. The vehicle's windows were tinted so completely that the city outside was transformed into a blurry abstract of neon lights and long, dark shadows. Isabella stayed pressed firmly against the far door, her hand still clenched tightly around the pepper spray canister in her pocket. Victor sat on the other side of the spacious leather seat. He did not look at her or acknowledge her presence in any way. His full attention was on a tablet computer, his features illuminated by the device's cold blue glow. He looked almost bored, an infuriating picture of calm for a man who had just orchestrated an escape from a gunfight. "You can release that now," Victor said, his gaze remaining fixed on his screen. If I had any intention of harming you, I would have simply allowed the Meyer brothers to perforate you on that sidewalk back in Queens. Why did you help me? Isabella demanded, and she was surprised to find her voice was perfectly steady, showing none of the violent tremors that were shaking her hands. You are a leader in the same criminal syndicate that methodically tore my family apart. You were partners with the Meyers. Victor finally set his tablet down on the seat between them, creating a deliberate physical barrier. He shifted his entire body to face her. In the enclosed space of the car, his presence felt immense, almost suffocating. He smelled of expensive scotch and something metallic, like the cold oil on a well-maintained firearm. Let me offer a correction, Victor said, his voice low and dangerously precise. My organization was contracted to manage the logistics of your father's asset liquidation. Moving valuable things discreetly is my area of expertise, not corporate espionage. However, when the Meyer family made the profoundly stupid decision to frame my organization for the arson that incinerated your family's warehouses in Hamburg, our business relationship was terminated. Immediately, and with prejudice. Isabella's expression hardened with suspicion. And I am simply supposed to believe that you are some innocent party in all of this? I expect you to believe that I am a practical man of business, Victor replied, his tone perfectly smooth. And exceptionally bad business practices require an equally forceful response. The Meyers now owe me a significant debt, and you, Isabella, strike me as someone who knows a great deal about, had revealed more about their whole organization than my most skilled operatives ever could. The sleek black luxury car reduced its speed, executing a flawless turn into the restricted underground garage of a monumental skyscraper made of glass and steel. The building seemed to scratch the sky itself. It was the infamous Callan Tower. Where are you taking me? Isa asked, her voice a strained wire of distrust. I am taking you to my home, Victor answered, his tone calm and deep. Because your little apartment is, at this very second, being systematically dismantled by the Mere family's professional killers. Every other sanctuary you might flee to will become your grave before morning. You are in the quiet center of a storm right now, Liebling. That German term of endearment, meaning darling, was delivered with a thick layer of condescending poison. A silent private elevator carried them straight to the summit of the colossal building. When the polished metal doors whispered open, they did not reveal a simple corridor, but the direct entrance to a penthouse suite. It was so enormous that it felt more expansive than the entire apartment complex Isa had lived in for the last 3 years. The interior was a stunning tribute to hyper-modern architecture, a symphony of cold, gleaming stone, deep, rich woods, and vast walls constructed entirely from seamless glass. These windows presented a breathtaking panoramic vista of the sparkling New York City empire spread out far below. Victor crossed the room with an effortless, predatory grace to a well-appointed wet bar, where he poured 2 glasses of a dark, amber-colored spirit. He held one out to her without a word. It's a vintage cognac, he stated. Considerably better than that cheap liquor you were pouring back at the Obsidian. Isa pointedly ignored the drink he offered. She stood her ground in the middle of the cavernous living room, her arms crossed tightly over her chest in a clear posture of defiance. Cut the polite host routine, Victor. Just get to the point and tell me what it is you really want from me. Victor raised his own glass and took a slow, measured sip of the expensive liquor. His cold, calculating eyes never left her face, watching her intently over the crystal edge. He found himself admiring her audacity. He knew that most individuals in her desperate circumstances would be groveling on the floor, either pleading for their life or lost in hysterical tears. But she, against all odds, was attempting to negotiate from a position of zero power. I want the codes, Victor stated at last, his voice dropping to a low, menacing whisper that coiled in the air between them. Isa's entire body tensed as if struck. I do not have the faintest idea what you are talking about. Do not lie to me, Isabella. It is a profound insult to my intelligence and to yours. Victor began to move toward her then, methodically closing the gap and deliberately invading her personal space, just as he had done before in the bustling restaurant. This time, however, there was no crowd of oblivious onlookers to serve as an unwitting shield for her. Your father, Heinrich, wasn't just shipping televisions and stereos in those cargo containers. He was secretly smuggling heavily encrypted server arrays for a powerful Swiss banking consortium. When the Mears initiated their brutal takeover of his import-export business, they found all the physical hardware. What they could not do was bypass the encryption to get at the priceless data within. The master keys for the encryption were missing. He came to a stop, his body now just inches from hers. Heinrich was old school. He never would have trusted something that important to digital storage alone. He gave the keys to the one person in the world he knew he could depend on without question. Someone he was absolutely sure would never betray his trust, regardless of the personal cost. Issa's heart pounded against her ribs like a trapped bird beating its wings against a cage. She fought a desperate battle to keep her face a blank canvas, an unreadable mask of complete indifference. "I am a waitress," she whispered, but the words felt fragile and unconvincing even to her own ears. "You are Isabella von Amsberg," Victor corrected her, his voice a deep, resonant growl that seemed to vibrate through her very bones. "And you are the one who knows the location of the master ledger. The Mears took your father's life because they were trying to find it. They have spent years systematically taking apart your life in their search for it. And just tonight, you demonstrated that you still possess access to their confidential operational logistics, which proves to me that you have a secret way into their private computer network." He lifted his hand slowly, letting it pause in the air just beside her face. She flinched away on pure instinct, but he did not make a move to harm her. Instead, his fingers gently brushed a loose strand of dark hair away from her cheek, tucking it behind her ear. His touch was surprisingly warm, his fingertips rough against her skin, yet the gesture was incredibly delicate. The contradictory feelings sent a wave of confused shivers down her spine. "The Mears are convinced you have that ledger," Victor went on, his voice soft now. "That conviction alone is enough to make you their #1 priority. But if you give that ledger to me, I can turn it into a weapon that will absolutely annihilate them. I can unravel their finances and drive their entire corporation into bankruptcy by sunrise tomorrow morning. I can give you the single thing you have wanted more than anything for 4 excruciatingly long years." "And what would that be?" Issa whispered, her voice almost inaudible. "Revenge." Issa locked her gaze with his. His eyes were the color of Arctic ice, impossibly cold, sharp, and without mercy. But looking deep into them, she saw a flawless mirror of the same furious hatred that smoldered inside her for the people who had destroyed her family and stolen her entire world. "Why on earth would I ever trust you?" she asked, her voice trembling just slightly with the weight of her desperation. "You are a monster, Victor. You are just a different breed of monster than they are." Victor turned away from her, moving back to the bar to set down his glass. "I am a monster," he conceded, without a single trace of shame or hesitation. "But I am a monster who meticulously honors every agreement he makes. The Mears are obsessed with ending your life. I am obsessed with watching them burn to the ground. In this particular war, that makes us perfect allies." He strolled over to the floor-to-ceiling window, staring down at the endless ocean of city lights that stretched to the horizon. "So this is my proposal. You will stay here, under my direct and personal protection. You will help me decipher the Mears' complex logistics network, using the deep knowledge I know you have of your father's old security protocols. Working together, we will bring their entire empire crashing down, one agonizing piece at a time. After they are completely ruined, I will provide you with $5 million and a brand new, perfect identity. You can finally vanish from the world for good, and you will be genuinely safe at last." Issa watched the imposing silhouette of his broad shoulders against the glittering city. This was, without a doubt, a pact with the devil himself. She had no illusions about the kind of man Victor Kalin was. He was a ruthless predator, an apex killer. But he was also correct. She was so profoundly tired of running, so sick of living every single day consumed by fear. She was weary down to her bones of serving drinks to entitled, wealthy men, while her father's killers flaunted the fortune they had stolen from her family. A new resolve hardened within her. She walked purposefully to the bar, picked up the untouched glass of cognac, and took a long, defiant drink. She felt the expensive alcohol blaze a trail of fire all the way down to her stomach. 10 million, she said, her voice now astonishingly clear and firm. Victor turned around slowly, and a real, unforced smile began to stretch across his lips. The expression completely changed his face, softening his severe, angular features into something that was not just human, but devastatingly handsome. I am sorry? $10 million, Issa repeated, her voice now ringing with unshakable conviction. And I do not want them to just be bankrupt. I want their name destroyed. I want the entire world to know exactly what kind of animals they are and what they did to my father. Victor actually laughed. It was a dark, rich sound that echoed in the vast, silent room. You certainly drive a hard bargain, Prinzessin. That is my offer. Take it or leave it, she shot back, holding his intense gaze without flinching. Victor closed the distance between them again, extending his large hand in her direction. Deal. $10 million, and I will personally deliver the head of Conrad Mir to you on a silver platter. Issa paused for only a heartbeat before she placed her own hand in his. His grip was incredibly strong and firm, swallowing her much smaller hand completely. It felt less like closing a business deal and more like sealing a sacred pact written in blood. But I have to warn you, Isabella, Victor added, not letting go of her hand, but instead using it to pull her a little closer, until their bodies were almost touching. This is not a game, any longer. You have stepped into my world now, and in my world, once I let you in, you are mine until every single debt is paid. The atmosphere between them suddenly felt electric, charged with a heavy, tangible heat. The feeling was no longer just fear. It had morphed into a powerful magnetic current that was pulling them inexorably toward each other. I do not belong to anyone, Issa stated, yanking her hand free, even as she felt her breath catch in her throat. We will see about that, Victor murmured, his eyes glowing with a dark promise. At that exact moment, the quiet chime of the elevator doors sounded through the penthouse. Stefan, Victor's most trusted subordinate, burst into the room, his face ashen and his expression frantic. Boss! Stefan gasped, his voice tight with panic. We have a massive problem. The New York Police Department just issued an all-points bulletin. For who? Victor asked, his voice sharp with irritation at the sudden intrusion. For her, Stefan answered, pointing a shaky finger directly at Issa. The Mears didn't just send a team to kill her tonight. They've also framed her for murder. They planted the gun that killed a police officer in Queens 3 weeks ago inside her apartment before their team went in. They are controlling the entire story. Issa Corwin is no longer just some waitress. As far as the NYPD is concerned, she is now a wanted cop killer. A shocked gasp escaped Issa's lips. The heavy crystal tumbler fell from her suddenly numb fingers, exploding into 1,000 glittering shards on the polished stone floor. Victor's expression hardened instantly, his face becoming as cold and unforgiving as chiseled granite. They are trying to force her out into the open, he said, his voice a low growl of pure fury. If the police get their hands on her, she will be dead in less than an hour. He turned his gaze back to Issa, and his eyes were now blazing with a terrifying new intensity. Welcome to the war, Isabella. From this moment on, there is no escape for you. There is no going back. For the following 3 weeks, it felt as though the entire planet outside the safety of Kalin Tower was engaged in a relentless manhunt for Isa Corwin, the fugitive wanted for killing a cop. Her photograph was everywhere, a constant fixture on every news broadcast and flashing across every digital billboard in the city. Her name scrolled in an endless loop across the bottom of the colossal screens that illuminated Times Square, turning her into the most infamous woman in New York. But inside the penthouse, she was a ghost. On the 45th floor of the skyscraper, time itself seemed to twist and coil around them. Their luxurious apartment had become something else entirely, a makeshift command center in a war fought with data and ghosts. The dining table, an immense polished piece of Italian marble, had vanished completely under a chaotic landscape of architectural blueprints, digital server logs, and old shipping manifests that Issa had painstakingly pieced together from memory. Issa had not truly slept in what felt like an eternity. Dark, crimson circles framed her eyes, a stark contrast to the pale, almost translucent quality of her skin, which had not seen sunlight in days. She was seated on the thick plush carpet, surrounded by an ocean of scattered documents, wearing only one of Victor's large white dress shirts, its hem falling to her knees like a tunic. Victor remained perfectly still by the massive window, observing the storm as it relentlessly threw rain against the reinforced glass. Far below, the sprawling city lights blurred into a dissolving watercolor painting, lost in the gray deluge. He finally pulled his gaze away from the tempest outside and let it rest on her. Seeing her there, dressed in his clothes, looking so small yet so intensely focused amid the controlled chaos of their mission, ignited a strange, constricting feeling in his chest. It was an unfamiliar sensation, one he had not allowed himself to feel in many, many years. This was no longer about protecting a valuable asset. It had become something dangerously personal. He understood this with a terrifying clarity, and that truth unsettled him more than any assassin's bullet ever could. "You have to eat something," Victor stated, his voice emerging with a rough edge he hadn't intended. He crossed the room and carefully set down a small plate of sliced fruit and cheese on the floor next to her. Issa didn't spare it a glance, her focus absolute. "I am so close, Victor. I can feel it in my bones. The encryption protecting the Mir family servers isn't just a random sequence of characters. It is a Polybius square cipher, but he modified it, made it personal." She absently tapped a pencil against her bottom lip, a nervous tick he now recognized and almost waited for. "My father used to show me ciphers when I was a child. He always made it seem like an intricate game we were playing." She paused, her eyes distant. The key. The key has to be something emotional, something he cherished. Heinrich never put his faith in machines for the things that truly mattered. He trusted memory. Victor lowered himself to the floor, sitting directly across from her. The formidable Mafia Don, seated on the expensive carpet as if he were a simple schoolboy. "What do you remember about the day he first gave you the access codes?" Issa shut her eyes, her mind diving deep into the past. "It was the day I turned 18. We were in his library, the one back in Zurich. He put on a record. It was Wagner. He looked at me and said, 'Isabella, chaos is the constant music of the world, but logic is the rhythm that gives it meaning.'" Her eyes flew open, wide and electric with a sudden, brilliant insight. The rhythm. It's the time signature of the music he was playing. She lunged for a nearby laptop, her fingers moving like lightning, across the keyboard with a renewed ferocious energy. Victor just watched her, completely captivated. He saw with stark clarity that she was not just a beautiful woman, she was utterly lethal. Her magnificent mind was a weapon of incredible power, one that had been tragically wasted and hidden away under a cheap waitress's apron for far too long. A vibrant green progress bar suddenly illuminated the laptop screen, racing to completion. Beneath it, two simple words materialized. "Access granted." Issa let out a sharp, involuntary gasp that sliced through the tense silence of the room. "I'm in," she whispered, her voice filled with awe and disbelief. "I have it all. The Mir family's hidden accounts, every illegal arms shipment, the human trafficking routes, complete with names, the complete records of bribes paid to federal judges. It's all right here. She at last raised her head to look at Victor, her eyes shimmering with a potent combination of pure, unadulterated triumph and unshed tears of relief. We have them, Victor. We have every last one of them. But Victor was not looking at the screen full of incriminating data. His intense gaze was locked entirely on her face, on the raw emotion displayed there. The powerful adrenaline of their victory finally shattered the invisible wall that had stood between them. He reached out, his large, calloused hands coming up to gently cup her face. His thumbs moved with an unexpected softness, carefully brushing away the dark, exhausted shadows from beneath her eyes. "You did it," he whispered, his voice thick with an emotion he could not name. "No," she corrected him softly, her breath catching in her throat as his face drew even closer to hers. "We did it." The very atmosphere in the room seemed to grow heavy and dense, charged with the electric potential of a storm about to break. The fragile tension between them finally shattered. Victor's intense focus shifted, his dark eyes slowly tracing the delicate curve of her lower lip. A primitive hunger began to coil deep inside him, a desperate, overwhelming need to claim her, to completely erase the world until only she remained. But he restrained himself, the air between them crackling with unspoken promises. "If I do this," Victor breathed, his voice a low, dangerous growl that hinted at both ruin and salvation, "there will be no stopping it." He needed her to understand the full weight of the decision. "Once we cross this line, we can never go back. Our professional arrangement will be finished." But Isabella did not pull away. She did not hesitate. Instead, she closed the remaining space, leaning into his solid, powerful frame. Her hand came up, moving with a slow, deliberate grace, and pressed flat against his chest, right over the steady muscle of his heart. Beneath her palm, she could feel the powerful, relentless beat of his heart, a primal, honest rhythm in a world that was constructed entirely of lies and deception. "I don't want to go back," she confessed, her quiet whisper sealing her fate and his. That was all the permission Victor needed. He closed the final inch of distance separating them. The kiss was not gentle or tentative. It was a violent collision, a desperate and overdue reckoning between two souls who had been starved of anything real for far too long. It was a brutal, claiming act of possession, fueled by a searing heat that felt like it could burn them both down to ash. Isabella's fingers tangled in the thick hair at the nape of his neck, pulling him closer, using him as her anchor as the entire room dissolved into a blur around them. In that one, stolen moment, the world outside ceased to exist. He was not a crime lord. She was not a fugitive running for her life. For one fleeting, perfect instant, they were just Victor and Isabella, completely lost in one another. But the precious illusion was violently shattered by the harsh, insistent buzzing of Victor's secure satellite phone on the table nearby. He pulled back from her reluctantly, resting his forehead against hers for a long second, his breathing coming in ragged, uneven bursts. He swore viciously under his breath in German before snatching the phone from the table. "Report," he commanded, his voice a low, menacing growl. Stefan's voice crackled through the speaker, strained with an unmistakable urgency. "Boss, we have a major problem. A huge one. The data you just accessed, it tripped a silent alarm deep in their system. The Myers know someone breached their network. Their technicians are actively tracing the IP address as we speak." "Disconnect the proxy server now," Victor ordered, surging to his feet and pulling Isabella up with him in one fluid motion. "How much time do we have before they pinpoint our location?" "There is no time," Stefan replied, his voice grim. "But that is not even the worst part. Conrad Meyer just authorized Protocol 0. He is scrubbing the servers completely clean. He plans to remotely delete every last byte of data within the next 2 hours. If that data is erased, all the evidence we have gathered will vanish with it. We cannot leak proof that has been wiped from existence." Isabella's face went completely ashen. He is wiping the offsite cloud backups too. Everything. Is there any possible way to stop it? Victor demanded, turning his sharp gaze to her. Isabella shook her head, her movements becoming frantic with rising panic. Not from here. The access I have is read only. To halt a Protocol Zero wipe, I would need to provide full biometric authorization. The system requires a complete retinal scan and a voice print confirmation to override the command. Whose biometrics? Victor pressed, his voice hard as stone. My father's, she said, her voice catching with emotion. Or his direct bloodline. Her eyes widened as she looked up at Victor, the terrible, impossible realization dawning on both of them at the exact same moment. Me? I have to be there, physically, to authorize the command to stop the wipe. But the only terminal with that level of administrative override is located deep inside the Meyer family's private server room. Where is that room located? The vault, Isabella answered, her voice trembling slightly with the weight of it all. It is built into the foundation beneath the Maritime Exchange building. Victor glanced down at his watch, his expression hardening into a grim mask of resolve. Tonight is the annual Maritime Charity Ball. The entire exchange building will be crawling with their private security, city police, politicians, and at least half of the Meyer family in attendance. Then we have to go to the ball, Isabella declared, her voice suddenly solid, miraculously infused with a core of pure steel. I have to get into that server room before those 2 hours expire. Victor looked at her, standing there in nothing but his shirt, a disheveled and wanted fugitive. Then he looked deeper and saw the unyielding fire burning in her eyes. Stefan, Victor spoke into the phone, his decision made in an instant. Get the car ready and bring the package I had shipped from Milan. It appears we are going out tonight. The Maritime Exchange building was less a structure and more a modern fortress disguised as a palace for high society. Gilded gold leaf climbed its towering columns like ivy, and massive crystal chandeliers, each the size of a small car, hung like spectacular frozen waterfalls from the impossibly high vaulted ceilings. Inside, the grand ballroom was a churning, glittering sea of expensive tuxedos and breathtaking designer gowns. It was a swirling vortex of New York's most powerful and corrupt elite, all of them sipping champagne that was ultimately paid for with blood and secrets. At the grand entrance, the security detail was, predictably, extremely intense. There were advanced metal detectors, painstaking identification checks, and a sophisticated facial recognition system that was networked directly into the city's police database. A long, sleek black limousine slid to a silent stop at the curb, and a valet in a crisp uniform hurried to open the rear door. Victor Kalin emerged from the vehicle. He was the perfect embodiment of an underworld king, dressed in a bespoke tuxedo that seemed to be molded to his broad shoulders and powerful frame like a piece of exquisite armor. He casually buttoned the single button of his jacket, his face a perfect mask of bored, untouchable arrogance. He then turned and extended a hand to the woman still seated inside the car. Isabella stepped out, and a palpable wave of silence rippled through the crowd of onlookers and photographers. She was nothing less than magnificent. She wore a stunning, elegant gown of midnight blue silk that clung to every single curve of her body, featuring a daringly high slit that climbed her thigh and a back that plunged to a dangerously low, alluring point. A cascade of diamonds, which had once belonged to Victor's own mother, sparkled like captured starlight at her throat and ears. But it was her face that truly sealed the breathtaking transformation. Her dark hair had been dyed a brilliant, shocking platinum blonde, and was styled in glamorous, old Hollywood waves that framed her face perfectly. Her makeup was expertly applied, sharp and dramatic, turning her features into a work of art. Her makeup was a subtle weapon, shifting the lines of her face just enough to deceive a security camera's algorithm while remaining invisible to the human eye. In one perfectly manicured hand, she clutched a Venetian mask, a beautiful accessory for the evening's theme, the masquerade of the sea. This is how injustice begins, with a mask and a lie. True power is the only thing that can protect you from men who hide behind wealth. Are you ready? Victor's voice was a low murmur against her ear, his hand a possessive weight on the curve of her spine. I was born for this, Isabella lied, her voice steady even as her heart hammered against her ribs like a bird caught in a cage. They moved up the grand red carpet, exuding a confidence they did not feel. When a guard blocked their path with a scanner, she held her breath. Your name? The man asked, his voice completely devoid of emotion. The guard's tone was flat and bored. Victor Kalin, Victor announced with effortless authority. And this is my companion, the Countess von Habsburg. The guard hesitated for only a second, a small flicker of doubt crossing his face. Without a word, Victor pressed a heavy, gold-plated coin into the guard's waiting palm. It was an unmistakable token from the syndicate, a symbol of a system built on corruption. The guard's eyes fell to the coin, then rose to meet Victor's chilling, unwavering stare. He instantly lowered the scanner, not even bothering to look at Isabella's forged identification papers. Please, enjoy your evening, sir. And with that simple exchange, they were granted entry. The grand ballroom was a suffocating crush of heat and noise. Isabella kept her mask firmly in place, a shield against the world. She held her mask high, her gaze sweeping across the opulent room with cold, methodical precision. It did not take long to find Conrad Meyer. He was standing near the orchestra, the center of an adoring circle of guests. He held a glass of expensive scotch, laughing as if he did not have a single worry in the world, as if he had not tried to have her killed just 3 weeks prior. The sight sent a spike of ice through her veins. The server room is hidden in the sub-basement, Isabella whispered into Victor's ear as he guided her through the steps of a slow, elegant dance. The only access point is a service elevator hidden in the kitchens. I will provide the distraction you need, Victor promised, pulling her closer, his grip possessively tight. You'll have exactly 10 minutes before the system wipe is permanent. Stefan has already taken care of the security feeds in the main hallway, but the server room itself is on a completely closed, offline network. The moment you step inside that room, you are utterly alone. Her own resolve surprised her. I can handle it, Isabella stated, her voice firm. Victor spun her in a graceful arc, dipping her low until her hair nearly brushed the polished floor. In the very heart of the swirling dance floor, he stared down into her eyes, his own intense and serious. I have no doubt you can. But if you are compromised, do not hesitate for me. You run. He raised her gloved hand to his lips, kissing it gently before releasing her. Isabella vanished into the dense crowd, her movements deliberate as she made her way toward the kitchen doors. Victor straightened his cufflinks and began a calm, deliberate walk directly toward the monster who had destroyed her family, Conrad Meyer. Isabella moved through the frantic chaos of the kitchen like a ghost. The staff was completely overwhelmed, consumed with preparing hundreds of lobster thermidor plates. They never saw the woman in the shimmering ball gown slip silently into the industrial freight elevator. She swiped a stolen key card that Victor had risked everything to obtain for her. The heavy steel doors ground shut with a heavy, final thud. Her finger trembled slightly as she pressed the button for the sub-basement. The elevator groaned as it began its slow, mechanical descent into the belly of the building. Isabella glanced at her watch. She had only 6 minutes left. When the doors finally slid open, they revealed a long, sterile corridor painted a blinding white. At the far end of the hallway stood a massive steel door, the vault. Isabella broke into a sprint, her heels clicking against the pristine floor. A biometric scanner glowed next to the handle. She ripped off her silk glove and pressed her palm hard against the cool glass plate. A synthesized voice echoed in the silence. Scanning. Authorization confirmed. Welcome, Isabella von Amsberg. With a series of loud, metallic clanks, the heavy locking bolts retracted. Isabella threw all of her weight against the enormous door, Shoving it open before she raced inside she froze, staring at the main console as her heart plummeted. A furious red light pulsed across the monitor, an alarm screaming a catastrophic failure. Deletion in progress. 85% complete. The words mocked her. She launched herself into the operator's chair, her fingers flying across the keyboard in a desperate blur. She could feel every single second slipping away like grains of sand. Please, please, just work, she pleaded silently, slamming the command for a full system override. A cold, synthesized voice filled the dead air of the room. Voice authorization required. Taking a deep, steadying breath, Isabella von Amsberg spoke her own name with perfect, ringing clarity. Authorization code, Alpha Omega Zurich. A silent pause stretched into an unbearable eternity. Voice confirmed. Deletion paused, recovering data. The immense tension inside her shattered, and she slumped back into the chair, letting out a single shuddering breath she felt as if she had been holding for 4 excruciating years. The screen glowed with a beautiful, reassuring green light. The lost files were rebuilding themselves, line by painful line. With hands that still trembled, she inserted the encrypted hard drive Victor had given her into the port. The data transfer protocol immediately initiated. Such a remarkably clever girl, a calm, familiar voice commented from the entrance. Isabella whipped around in her chair as a paralyzing cold seized her entire body. Conrad Meyer stood in the doorway, casually aiming a pistol fitted with a suppressor. He was supposed to be upstairs. He was supposed to be neutralized by Victor. She had been completely devastatingly wrong. The man in the ballroom had to have been a body double, or Conrad had somehow slipped away the very instant Victor began his approach. Did you honestly believe you could simply walk into my home and take my most valuable secrets? Conrad sneered, stepping fully into the server room. You are the very image of your father, just as arrogant, and in a moment, you will be just as dead. Isabella scrambled backward until her back hit the cold metal of the server racks. The download was only at 60%. She desperately needed to buy more time. You were the one who killed him, she accused, her voice shaking with a deep, consuming rage she had suppressed for years. You did not just steal his entire company from him, you murdered him in cold blood. He was a weak fool, Conrad responded with a dismissive shrug of his shoulders, raising the pistol higher. Business is a world that belongs to the strong, Isabella, and you are just a loose end that I need to tie up for good. He took careful aim directly at the center of her chest. Bang! The explosive sound of the shot was deafening in the small, enclosed space. Isabella flinched violently, squeezing her eyes shut as she braced for the searing pain of the bullet. But the pain never came. She cautiously opened her eyes. Conrad Meyer was still standing, an expression of utter shock carved onto his face. A small, dark red flower was rapidly blooming across the fabric of his expensive suit jacket. His gun fell from his limp fingers and clattered onto the concrete floor as he staggered backward. Behind him, perfectly framed in the doorway with a smoking pistol in his hand, stood Victor. His tuxedo was torn, and his lip was split and bleeding. He had clearly fought his way down here to reach her. I told you, Victor growled, stepping over Conrad's gasping, writhing body as if he were nothing more than trash. She belongs to me. Victor never even spared Conrad a second glance. His intense eyes were locked completely on Isabella. Is the transfer complete? Almost, she managed to say, her hands shaking so badly she could barely point toward the screen. It is at 90%. Conrad groaned from his place on the floor, clutching his bleeding shoulder. You are both absolute fools, he wheezed, struggling for each breath. Do you actually think you can just walk out of here? I triggered the silent alarm the very moment the vault was breached. The police are already swarming this entire building. You are completely trapped. Victor walked calmly over to the console and ejected the drive the exact second the progress bar reached 100%. He slid the small device safely into his inner jacket pocket. We are not trapped with you, Victor said coldly. grabbing Isabella's hand and pulling her forcefully along with him. "We are leaving now." "But how?" Isabella asked, her ears catching the distant sound of sirens now wailing from the street level far above their heads. "The elevators will be completely locked down by this point." Victor kicked open a large, rusted grate in the floor. It revealed a dark, damp tunnel that stretched out into complete blackness. It was an old smuggler's passage from the Prohibition era, one that connected directly to the city's subway system. "We go down," Victor commanded, gesturing toward the yawning darkness below. He turned to look at her then, his blue eyes fierce and unwavering in the dim light. "Do you trust me?" Isabella looked at this complicated man who had mocked her, saved her, and now had taken a life for her. She saw the fresh blood on his knuckles and the absolute burning devotion in his eyes. "With my life," she answered without a single moment of hesitation. They jumped down into the darkness together, leaving the crumbling empire of Conrad Meyer to rot behind them, just as a heavily armed police tactical team breached the server room doors high above. The tunnel was filled with the foul stench of stagnant water and old, decaying metal. For what felt like a lifetime, Victor and Isabella navigated the pitch-black passage, the sounds of chaos at the Maritime Exchange slowly dissolving into a dull, distant memory far above them. Victor kept a powerful hand on Isabella's arm, his presence a steady anchor guiding her through the suffocating darkness. His other hand was pressed tightly against his side, where a graze from a ricocheting bullet, one she had been too consumed by adrenaline to even notice in the server room, was bleeding slowly but steadily. They finally climbed out into the cool night air, finding themselves beneath the massive, shadowy support pillars of the Brooklyn Bridge. The dark river water lapped against the concrete foundation below, looking like black oil in the faint moonlight. "Stefan is 5 minutes away," Victor rasped, his voice strained as he checked his watch. He leaned heavily against a pillar for support, his face appearing ghostly and pale under the moon. "We actually did it." Isabella clutched the priceless hard drive that was now safe in her pocket. "Not quite. Having the information is one thing. Learning how to use it without getting us both killed is an entirely different challenge." A sleek black speedboat cut through the dark water, its powerful engine a low, confident purr. Stefan was at the helm. He expertly guided the boat to a service ladder, and they scrambled aboard without wasting a second. As the boat accelerated away from the shore, racing toward the vast, open ocean, and leaving the frantic sirens of Manhattan far in their wake, Isabella looked back at the glittering, indifferent skyline. This was not a retreat. It was a calculated and devastating counteroffensive. Precisely 3 days following her vanishing act, the digital world was brought to its knees in a meticulously planned apocalypse of information. At 8 o'clock in the morning, a data bomb detonated across the servers of every influential news outlet in New York, London, and Zurich. This was no mere leak of sensitive documents. It was a tidal wave of irrefutable proof. The Amsberg archives unleashed terabytes of high-definition video footage, flawless audio recordings, and undeniable financial ledgers. The video captured Conrad Meyer, his face a mask of arrogance, giving the explicit command to incinerate the von Amsberg warehouses. The files also exposed the clear electronic trail of money transferred directly to a corrupt precinct captain. This was the very same captain who had personally entered Isla's apartment to plant an unregistered firearm, a deliberate act designed to frame her for a crime she did not commit. The mountain of evidence also contained dashboard camera footage from a vehicle in the Mir convoy, which proved beyond all doubt that they were responsible for the tragic death of the police officer in Queens. It was the exact crime for which Isla had been falsely and publicly condemned. Meanwhile, Isla herself remained perfectly composed inside a secure safe house, a breathtakingly modern villa nestled on a remote private island just off the main coastline. She watched the ensuing chaos unfold on a massive television screen as the world reeled. "Breaking news," the anchor stammered, his voice trembling and his face ashen with disbelief. "We have just received confirmation that federal agents have stormed the Mir family compound in the Hamptons. Conrad Meir, who remains hospitalized under a heavy police detail, has been formally charged with racketeering, murder, and the stunning charge of high treason. The treason allegation stems from the illicit sale of military-grade encryption technology to hostile foreign powers. All pending charges against Isla Corwin, who authorities have now correctly identified as Isabella von Amsberg, have been immediately and unequivocally dismissed. With a soft, final click, Isla powered down the television. An absolute silence descended upon the room, a profound quiet that felt like the end of a long and brutal war. It was truly, finally over. The monster that had occupied her every thought was now secured in a cage. She heard the faint sound of footsteps on the hardwood floor behind her. It was Victor, standing in the frame of the doorway, in the entrance. He had managed to clean himself up, but his posture was still rigid and his movements careful, a clear reminder of his recent injuries. He was dressed flawlessly in a dark, expertly tailored suit and held a thick manila envelope in one hand. "The helicopter is fueled and waiting for you," Victor stated, his voice completely devoid of any emotion, as if he were concluding a sterile business transaction. "It is scheduled to transport you to Boston. From that location, a private jet is prepared for a non-stop flight directly to Zurich." He crossed the expansive room and, with deliberate slowness, placed the envelope on the gleaming coffee table. "Inside this, you will discover your new passport, along with the original title deed to your father's former estate. I took the initiative to repurchase it from the bank earlier this morning. You will also find a certified check for the sum of $10 million. Our agreement has been fulfilled to the letter." Isla's intense gaze moved from the thick envelope to his unreadable, stoic face. "And that is everything? The deal is officially concluded?" A single muscle tightened in Victor's jaw. "You told me you wanted your life back, Isabella. Now you possess it once more. The entire Mere criminal organization has been systematically dismantled. Your name has been cleared across the globe. You are, once again, an exceptionally wealthy woman. My world is no place for someone like you. You witnessed what happened at the charity ball with your own eyes. It is a world filled with blood, bullets, and dark forgotten tunnels. That is not a life, it is a prison sentence without parole." He started to pivot away from her, seemingly incapable of holding her gaze for a moment longer. "Go back to the light where you belong, princess. Go back and do your best to forget you ever had to descend into this darkness and cross paths with me." With a newfound and surprising grace, Isla rose from her chair. She calmly walked to the table and picked up the heavy envelope. "Victor." Her voice stopped him in his tracks, but he refused to turn and face her. "You speak absolutely flawless German," she said, effortlessly switching to his native language, her accent completely perfect. "But you still possess absolutely no understanding of women." Hearing that, Victor rotated around with a slow, deliberate motion, his expression a complete mystery. Isla walked with purpose toward the large stone fireplace, where a quiet fire was crackling. She held the thick envelope out over the flickering orange flames. "What do you believe you are doing?" Victor's voice was suddenly sharp, his eyes widening in sheer disbelief as he understood her intention. She simply relaxed her fingers and let the envelope fall. The fire greedily licked at the paper, consuming the passport, the deed, and the $10 million check in a blaze. The tangible promises of her former life twisted into black ash within seconds. "I do not want the money," Isla stated, stepping over the pile of ashes to position herself directly in front of him. "And I have zero desire to return to Zurich. There is absolutely nothing remaining for me in that city, except for ghosts and the weight of painful memories." "Then what is it that you possibly want?" Victor demanded, his legendary self-control finally beginning to fracture. "Do you wish to return to your life as a waitress? Do you want to waste your nights refilling endless water glasses for less than minimum wage?" "No," Isla replied softly. She reached up with one delicate hand and gently straightened his tie, her fingers lingering for just a moment on the expensive silk fabric. I came to an important realization in that server room. My father was a good man, an exceptionally good man, but he was ultimately weak because he insisted on fighting all of his battles completely alone. You are an incredibly powerful man, Victor, but you are completely hollow on the inside for the very same reason. You always fight alone. She lifted her chin and looked directly into his piercing ice blue eyes. I do not want to be a waitress, and I absolutely refuse to ever be a victim again. I want to be a partner. Victor could only stare at her, utterly blindsided by her words. The silence that grew between them felt heavy and was electric with unspoken potential. You must comprehend what you are asking of me. There is no retirement plan in this kind of life. There are no fairy tale happy endings. I do not want a happy ending, Isla whispered, her voice overflowing with conviction. I want a real one. She rose up on her toes and pressed her lips to his. This kiss was nothing like their first desperate, frantic one. This was a solemn promise. It was the official seal on a contract that was far more binding than any amount of money could ever be. In that single instant, all of Victor's carefully constructed defenses shattered into dust. He wrapped his strong arms around her, pulling her body tightly against his, as if he were trying to merge their two souls into one being. Stefan is going to be absolutely livid, he murmured against her hair, the faintest hint of a smile touching his voice. He is thoroughly convinced that you are a terrible influence on me. Isla let out a laugh, and the sound was wonderfully bright and completely free. Well, from now on, Stefan can get his own coffee. 1 month later, the atmosphere inside the Obsidian Lounge was electric, humming with vibrant energy. It was a Friday night, and every single table was occupied by the city's elite. Suddenly, the large front door swung open, and a deep, profound silence fell over the entire crowded room. Victor Kalin strode in, looking every bit as dangerous and regal as a monarch surveying his kingdom. But this evening, he was not alone. On his arm was a woman dressed in a breathtaking, floor-length crimson gown. Her dark hair was swept elegantly over one shoulder, and she carried herself with an air of absolute, unshakable confidence. The patrons began to whisper frantically among themselves. They all instantly recognized her face from the relentless news cycle. She was the lost heiress who had single-handedly brought down the entire formidable Mir Empire. A host guided them to table 4, the exact same table where Victor had so callously mocked a simple waitress only a few short weeks before. Arthur, the manager who seemed to live in a perpetual state of anxiety, rushed over, sweating heavily under the moody lighting. He was clutching a wine list with hands that were visibly shaking. Mr. Kalin, Miss von Amsberg, welcome back to the lounge. It is a genuine honor to have you with us tonight. Isla studied Arthur for a long, quiet moment. Then her gaze shifted to the terrified young waitress standing just behind him, a girl who looked completely drained of all energy. Her apron was noticeably stained, and her feet were surely aching, in a pair of cheap, poorly fitting heels. Isla gently reached out and took the wine list from Arthur's trembling grasp, then handed it to the young waitress. Please take the remainder of the evening off, Isla said, her voice gentle but carrying an unmistakable note of authority. As a matter of fact, you should take the entire next week off, with full pay, of course. Arthur began to sputter, his face a perfect picture of utter confusion. But I cannot. Isla's voice turned cool and as sharp as steel. I own the building now, Arthur, and I can give you my word, things are about to change significantly around here. We will begin with the way you treat your employees. She then turned her attention back to Victor, who had been observing the entire interaction with an expression of pure, unfiltered pride on his face. So, she inquired, a playful smirk dancing on her lips, what do you have to say for yourself? Not too bad for a person who is supposed to be completely empty on the inside, correct? Victor lifted her hand to his lips and pressed a soft kiss to her knuckles. Niemals leer, meine Königin, he answered quietly in German. You were never empty, my queen. I was simply far too blind to truly see you. Isla smiled, raising her wine glass in a silent toast between them. Together, they had burned their old world down to the ground so that they could construct a new one from the smoldering ashes. And this time, she was not the one serving the wine. She was the one who was calling all of the shots. And that is the remarkable story of Isla and Victor. Their journey together started with a cruel, dismissive insult, spoken in a language he incorrectly assumed she could not possibly comprehend. It reached its conclusion with her completely rewriting the rules of his entire ruthless and unforgiving game. It serves as a powerful reminder that you should never, ever judge another person based on their uniform or their perceived station in life. Victor believed he was looking down upon a powerless and insignificant servant. In reality, he was standing before a fierce survivor, a resilient woman who had learned how to transform her deepest trauma into an unstoppable weapon and her pained, forced silence into a mighty roar that was loud enough to bring an entire criminal empire crashing down. So, what was your final verdict on Isla's decision? Should she have taken the $10 million and simply disappeared to live a peaceful, anonymous life? Or did she make the absolute right call by choosing to stay and build a brand new empire with Victor? I truly want to hear your thoughts, so please make sure to leave them in the comments down below. If you found yourself invested in this tale of calculated revenge, unlikely romance, and ultimate justice, please do me a huge favor and smash that like button. Share this video with your friends, and do not forget to subscribe and ring that notification bell. That way, you will never miss a single new story.